Welcome to this Board Assurance webinar. I'm Laura Courtney, Policy and External Affairs Manager at CHC, and I'll be facilitating this session. At CHC, we've been supporting members to cope with the immediate impacts of the Covid-19 crisis. However, it is also important to look ahead. And for this reason, we are delighted that Altair are able to deliver this session for us at such a timely moment. This webinar will be recorded and circulated to the sector in due course. Thank you to those who've submitted questions in advance. We've passed these on to the presenters. And if you would like to ask a question anytime during the session, please type it in the question box, which is on the control panel on the right of your machine. You can do this, as I say, anytime. So I'm going to turn off my video for the main session and then return to read your questions to our presenters in around 20 minutes time. We'll aim to get through as many questions as possible in the allotted time, but if we don't get to your question, we'll make sure we get an answer and circulate all the Q&As with the recording of the webinar. So that's all from me. I'm delighted to hand over to Sinead and Joanne from Altair.
Thank you very much. And we're just going to try and get the screen up, which I'll just do now for you. She says, successfully. Whoops. Oh dear. I'm failing on the first. There we go. Apologies about that, everyone. Oh, there we go. Apologies about that. I know that's everybody. Some of the things that we've all been struggling with, I'm sure, with COVID-19 is the technology and the changes we've been making. So as Laura has said, Joanne and I are going to be talking through some of the changes that you have already been making and doing, and looking to the next stage of the work that you need to be doing. And some of these photos hopefully depict kind of the changes that you as organizations have been undergoing, both and personally. So we've seen kind of the workplace change quite dramatically, to many of us, the majority working at home and juggling things. We've seen obviously the service delivery having to change quite dramatically, the challenges of getting PPE, the practices of having to change dramatically. And I'm sure we've all many of us have experienced the changes in our community and society, and having to juggle work and home and homeschooling, etc. And of course, I think really governance has changed. You as board members and those involved in governance, the challenges of change and you have to implement in crisis. You've also had to undertake quite a few of these. You've gone from board meetings, meeting around a table, to meeting remotely, and many of you might be, you might be in different stages. Many of you might be very comfortable with it now. Other organizations might be still struggling a little. And I think I just wanted to pause at this moment just to say that we'll be talking about assurance generally and looking at the services and the business. But I don't want you to lose the opportunity of remembering the changes that you have made as a board and your governance structure. You might have been meeting more regularly. You might have created a smaller committee that has delegated powers. Maybe you have changed from, because you're meeting more regularly, not having copious amounts of papers, but actually consolidating your decision making through presentations. I've seen an organization that usually has 200 pages of paper, 250. They consolidated that to 30 presentation slides, and decisions were able to be made through those slides. So I think you need to remember to do the learning from what you have already done. I put down there as well, there's been quite a lot of change in terms of focus on the operational and not the strategic. And also there has been those changes that you've had to make in terms of the legal requirements or the signing of documents. And these challenges, hopefully you've been able to share with others to get some solutions. But I think the important thing that you need to be doing is doing the learning, taking what has worked for you out of this stage and cementing it into your more common practice. And it's only through that, really, through that learning, that you will then be able to make that challenging transition possibly back to the very strategic role that you have as boards. And part of ensuring that you're able to do that is having the assurance that what you're doing and what you have done recently is being measured. And these slides here just demonstrate a little bit about the decisions that you've all had to make over the last few weeks. That transition of home working, people have said that they've implemented a 5-year plan in 7 or 8 days, you know, and I'm sure we're not alone in that. Importantly, putting things in for the staff and tenant well-being. Compliance is a big issue, and of course, you know, some have furloughed quite a number of staff, others not so much, but it's still issues that you need to be reviewing and making sure that you're complying, I think, with every aspect of the work. And importantly, there's been a lot of delegated authority and seeing where those decisions have been made by the exec. And really, as board members, it's really key that you understand the decisions that you've made and that you understand the impact of those decisions. So I'm hoping that you have all been stress testing your business plans. You should have already done that and put your assumptions in and seen where you sit with that. And I think now it's about ensuring that you have the right levels of assurance. And I suppose maybe I should touch on, you know, what do I mean by assurance? And I suppose it's the function, isn't it, of bringing the strategy and risk and controls together and presenting it in a way that demonstrates efficiency and effectiveness of your decision making, and that it demonstrates your compliance with statutory obligations. That's the key role of assurance. And in order really for you to be able to move forward, you need to make sure that what you've put in place in your insurance, considering the changes that you have made recently, really reflect what needs to be measured. And I suppose what sits beneath that assurance framework, or creates part of that assurance framework, is knowing that you're looking in the right place, that you are asking the right questions and prioritizing the key areas to look at, that you are looking at the right information, and actually that you're asking for the right information and asking for it at the right time. And I suppose that's where you need to be looking at getting that information from your executives, from the reports, measuring against the KPIs, looking also at what your external assurances are and your internal assurance audit program. So all of these elements will put you in good stead then to be able to move to the new restart phase, as we've kind of labelled it for the purpose of this workshop webinar. So if I hand over now to Joanne, who is going to talk now about the next stage.
Thank you, Sinead. Yes, I'll take you through the restart phase, starting with what you might want to be capturing. So members of staff may already now be reflecting on the changes that they've seen as a result of the crisis, especially on their quality of life. Undoubtedly, many of us are spending much less time commuting than we will have done previously, So we've also found that we've used a variety of tools. We've had Zoom, Teams, webinar, virtual viewings we've seen during this crisis, and this may have made work differently for employees. They may have found it more interesting, or they may just have found it different for them. But could some of this be continued in the longer term? Is there an opportunity for the informal somehow being brought into a more formal organisation? There is just a word of caution on the slide there under staff that we just sort of say to remember, it may still be too new for some members of staff. They may still feel too unsettled. Not everybody reacts to change at the same pace. So whilst there's lots you can start to capture, just be aware that for some it can still be very unsettling. In terms of your board and exec, many are already considering the restart phase and have already started asking themselves, well, how did we manage the crisis? In those first few weeks, how did we do? How did we react to it? Did we have everything in place? Could we switch quite quickly from office-based to remote working, mobile phones, laptops? How did we actually do in that process? Did it all work? And could we have done things better or just differently? And as you start to consider how you performed and what lessons could be learned, you might also need to recognise that this might not be the only pandemic or testing situation that could arise in the future. And Shona and I have spoke earlier today about, how many business continuity plans were pulled out of the drawer, off the shelf, opened on laptops. Is it now time for a pandemic plan? How will you do this going forward? So if we can just move on to the next slide, we'll start to have a look at the areas that you might need to consider. So when we think about financial viability, what impact has all of this had on your financial viability? What does it mean for your business going forward? Can you still achieve your corporate plan, or do you need to reprioritise? Does it mean that you're going to have to forego some things that you anticipated doing in this financial year and have a look at areas where money needs to be spent differently? What will business as usual look like? Everybody keeps referring to when we go back to normal, but what will business as usual look like? What will it involve? Will it involve reopening all of your offices if you have a number of offices, or will there be an element of office and remote working? How will your services be delivered? We've seen an increase in digitalisation of services. So what will you do in the future? And how are you going to communicate with your tenants? What have you done differently over these past weeks? Do you want to go back to those old ways, or do you want to carry on as with things that you've been doing over the recent weeks? You also need to think about compliance with all your laws and regulations, and obviously health and safety. But also we've just added a bullet point on this slide here around revised pay and reward strategy. So are your staffing implications, are they understood? The furlough scheme has just been extended again in the last few days. What does that mean? What does it mean for your annual leave, for your holidays, for your members of staff? Annual increases, but also terms and conditions. So all of these things that as you go into this restart phase, you will need to be considering. If we could go on to the next slide where we look at your corporate plan. So as we think about those areas that we need to consider, your corporate plan, your risk registers, and probably your audit programs will all need to be revisited. This isn't a complete list, I should say. These are just some of the areas that have been highlighted as we've been having conversations with organisations. If we start with development, if you've got a development programme, what are you going to do if properties are unsold? And how are you going to mitigate effects of impairment on your balance sheet? If we move across to looking at housing management, there's lots of concerns around arrears, rent and service charge collection. There's a number of residents, a number of your customers will be on furlough and may see short-term contracts going forward. What does that then mean for rent collection? Safeguarding is also something that's been raised. With this increased isolation, what is the impact of this? Will we see an increase in referrals to authorities? And could there be a greater demand for properties and other services as we start to come out of lockdown? In terms of asset management, we are hearing that customers are already stockpiling repair requests for you. How are you going to deliver this? How are you going to meet their expectations going forward? And have you considered the implications of supply chain and the risks of you obtaining parts as the repairs programme starts across the country? And then in terms of health and safety compliance, as this comes back, as you start addressing all the areas under health and safety, what is required to be compliant once more? We've identified care there. We understand that a number of people on the webinar today deliver a range of care services. So have you considered how you're going to provide this in the future? PPE, for example, staff wellbeing. And all of this has an impact on your business plan. Sinead's already mentioned that you've undoubtedly already been doing a range of stress tests to get your assurance on the viability. There's an impact on potentially your rent policy, just picking another one out of there. Bad debt provision as a result of impact on rent and service charge collection. And also, if you operate in a complex organisation and have commercial subsidiaries, what does that mean for your business in terms of cash flow? So if we can just summarise, we ask that you consider the lessons that you have learned or are still learning. There will be new opportunities in terms of how you deliver services and also your operating model. We'll ask you to consider what has gone well, what has gone not so well, and embed that into your future plans. And keep talking to your auditors, keep talking to the regulator, keep them up to date with any significant changes that you will need to take place as a result of this crisis. You'll absolutely need to revisit your risk assessments and likely to need to go back to your audit plans. These are key pieces of assurance for board and committee members. And keep testing the temperature. How is the business doing? Do you know how the business is doing? You know, you've got your KPIs that, again, Sinead's already mentioned. There's a lot of surveys being undertaken at the moment, especially around well-being for staff. So there's a lot of ways that you can just do that temperature check, but also have triggers in place to enable you to mitigate against the risks to your business. So that's our presentation for today. We've just kept within the timescale there. So thank you very much, and we're happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting and useful. We've already had a couple of questions on the questions function there on which is on the right-hand control panel. If anyone has any others, then please do type them in now. I'll start by just reading through these questions for you. So the first one, part of the success of remote working has been because of the strong culture and values of the organisation, of the person who's asking the question, but I think probably that's where it has been most successful across the board. But obviously the concern is, does this fall away if remote working becomes the new norm, especially when we have new staff? And in that respect, do you have any kind of advice?
Do you want me to start on that? I think this has become an issue that people recognise, you know, that successful home working is very much based on trust. And I think the cultures of organisations that have kind of promoted that, I think moving forwards, it's not going to be clear cut who people working from home all the time or not. And I think what you really need is to really focus on that relationship between the manager and an employee and really engage, I think, a little bit more in terms of that support that people are able to give organizations and individuals. So I think it is going to change things, but I do think that you need to be really investing a lot in that management and how you're engaging with your staff, particularly, as you say, new ones, new members of staff, the culture and engaging with organisations. You know, we're at the moment kind of recruiting for possibly new board members or new members of staff, and that's the big concern that organisations have, is that they're not able to kind of really induce and do that proper induction. But I think there are ways that things are happening that we are seeing that are really quite positive.
I think if I
Anything
could
else?
also add there, sorry, Charlotte, if I can just add, there's also some new opportunities as well when you're doing recruitment to attract different members to your team that you may not have been able to attract in the past when we've had rigid fixed office hours. So, you know, as organisations consider their operating model, there may be opportunities to explore different markets to be able to attract people into housing going forward, and they may be attractive to existing members as well, existing members of staff, not just new members of staff. So as the operating model changes, there may be some opportunities there that will keep that culture going in the organisation.
Definitely, that's a really interesting opportunity, and I think probably following on from what you're saying there on two things. Firstly, in terms of that kind of staff management, is there anything you'd say about the relationship between boards and chief execs and the exec team in that spirit as well? And then also in terms of the wider opportunities around attracting board members, anything particular that springs to mind about additional opportunities there?
Yeah, if I start with that one, Sinead, I think what I've seen with the organisations that we've been working with recently, where people have gone from being around the board table to using technology to have their board meetings, they're still quite formal into some respects. You've got your agenda, your papers, whether they be presentations or detailed papers, and what they're doing outside of that is finding more informal ways to communicate. So board briefings being done by teams, you know, quick catch-ups, but face-to-face catch-ups. And we're finding that board members are really receptive to that, because they get to have the conversations about any issues that they may want to just discuss, or they may have heard something that they want to just ensure that the organisation is dealing with, and just to get some of that peace of mind, some of that assurance on an ongoing basis outside of the formal committee cycle. So rather than lots of telephone calls, lots of emails, you know, people are starting to get more onto whether it be Zoom or Team or any other technology platform, you know, to have the conversations on a more informal basis. So I think that's working quite well.
And I think maybe on the with the relationship with the chief execs and the executives and the board, I think we kind of touched on it right at the beginning of the slide. I think this period has seen quite a lot of delegation of decision making, maybe that is kind of sitting with the chief exec, and also there has been some simplification of decision making by the board. I think there's two things. I think it's about keeping those aspects that have made the board a lot more efficient, and I think made the decision making a lot more efficient around the board. Don't go back to the old ways, because that was always the way that you used to do things. And I think it's quite pertinent when people have been forced to make really big decisions, how much information you really need to make those decisions. And I also think for boards in particular, I know I've said in the presentation, but I think moving from the operational to the very strategic role, and I think the more that you make sure that you're delegating the operational and those decision making down to your executives, which is why they're there, then you are clearing that space, that headspace, which we constantly hear from boards are missing or lacking, is that time to do that very strategic thinking. And on that, you know, people might be thinking now about their AGMs or thinking about an away day. What we're seeing is people aren't doing that traditional full day because it's not feasible like this, but rather bringing boards together and talking about specific issues for an hour and a half, 2 hours. So it's breaking things down and doing it into chunk size. So there's a lot to kind of consider, I think.
Definitely, thank you. We've had a couple more questions. Firstly, what's your view on placing reliance on external sources of assurance, because this is becoming much less visible currently?
So external assurance at this moment in time. Yeah, it is obviously more of a challenge. I know that audit firms are gearing up to do a lot more of their work remotely, especially as we sort of start thinking about the year-end work. I think a lot of the external providers will operate remotely from a head office, so they will have the facilities all ready to be able to do this. It will be them adapting their programs to be able to do them online and do them remotely. Examples we could give are where we provide assurance, so where we undertake governance reviews, we've moved all of that to remote now. So we do all the interviews, all the observations, all remotely. And I know from talking to finance directors that they're working with their auditors on their timetables to be able to do remote audit reviews for year end.
Great.
And I think, in fact, the feedback that we're getting from quite a few is year end has seemed to gone more streamlined and easier under these circumstances. So I think it is about reflecting on that.
Definitely. So one question is, the exec is sharing with us a weekly review of compliance with the 6 top risks. It'd be useful to hear your views on other indicators it is recommended as they board review regularly. This is a question as written. Our finance director has confirmed that our covenants are okay, but anything else would be useful. So in terms of other indicators beyond the normal kind of top 6 type.
Yeah, I think I'd probably want to look at it in the round. So I'd be having a look at the risks that are the top 6 risks that are being managed, but also understanding any stress testing that's been undertaken on the business plan, and also any impact on key performance indicators. So I think it's about looking at that information in the round rather than looking at it in isolation. And when you're looking at the risks, understanding what the triggers are. So is there, does it have to reach a certain percentage before action's being taken? So what are the controls to mitigate, and are there clear triggers in place? But looking at it, in the round of stress testing that's been undertaken on the business plan as well.
Thank you. Anything on that, Sinead?
No, I think Joanne's really covered that. Yeah, I'll if there's another question, that's fine.
We are having a few more questions and also a lot of comments on the things that you've said already. We're nearly out of time now. So as I said at the beginning, we'll put the questions that are coming through now to Sinead and Joanne, and just make sure that they're sent through to you when we send the recording of this around. And thank you so much for that presentation, Sinead and Joanne. It was really, really useful. Lots of really, really good pointers there. There are a few things that I'd like to flag from the CHC side just before we go. So we were discussing safeguarding there. We've got another webinar on social housing, keeping tenants safe, on Tuesday 26th of May, and that's from 2 till 2:45. So if that would be of interest of anyone, please do check that on the website. We also have 2 online meetings of the chairs and vice chairs strategic delivery groups coming up on the 21st of May from 6 till 7, and on the 22nd of June from 10:30 till 11:30. And just a couple more things that we'll be in touch with you about shortly. An online meeting of the Regulation and Governance Strategic Delivery Group, and the next virtual board networking session. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. We will end this session now. Thank you very much. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.